Thank you, President Gerger and council members. And this is going to be actually myself, Chief Anderson, and Assistant Chief Oxton will be giving the presentation tonight. And I first want to thank you. And this is a discussion, the one we're having, the presentation tonight. Some of you may have seen, some folks in the public may have seen. This is just updated a little bit from a public safety summit we did earlier. We've given this presentation a few times, but I wanted to just preface and start with, I know Councilmember Hontos had requested early, Council Member Lewis had a little different. You wanted to hear a little bit more about the Cough House, and the Chief's going to elaborate a little bit more about that. And then we had a request from Councilmember Hontos about statistics, and as I mentioned, I think that was early. It might have been late spring, early summer, but as I mentioned when I gave the budget presentation, we wanted to make sure that this was meaningful and updated even with the numbers from this year. So we're doing this, as I mentioned when I presented the budget, that we would do this in October so that we could have September numbers, and you'll see that calls for service. We don't actually get the crime statistics from the FBI until they come a little later. So you'll see the 2020 numbers, but you'll at least see the calls for service, and Assistant Chief Oxton will kind of go over that piece. But I also wanted to, before we had this presentation here, wanted to present the budget, and that's what I did in August also, because that's important, because the budget that reflects our priorities in public safety. So rather than have the presentation talk about where we would be, I wanted to present it to the council so that you would have that opportunity, because one of the things that we started a number of years ago was our indicators of success in our budgeting process. For those of you who've been on the council for a long period of time, we did that so you could see when we pass a budget, when I present a budget every year in August, it's not just spending money. We want to make sure that what we spend money on, we can see results, we can see trends. So that budget that I presented in early August adds in public safety. In fact, every budget I presented since I've been mayor adds additional resources to public safety, because that is, I believe, and I firmly believe that's what the public believes, is our top priority, is public safety. So when we are spending dollars in public safety, we should look at what type of results we get, and that's why we implemented indicators of success. That's one of the first things we go over when we do the budget presentations in August, is what are those trend lines. And I wanted to wait a little bit with that budget too, and those trend lines, because 2020, and I think Councilmember Laraway probably said it many times during that budget, it's an anomaly. 2020 will be an asterisk in our budgeting process and our indicators of success and all the trends that we do, because it wasn't a normal year anywhere. And it certainly wasn't a normal year in a lot of things that happened. But you will see some things that may surprise you when we talk about the crime statistics and what we do. We look at a trend line just not from year to year. We look at a trend line over a long period of time. We go back 5, 10, even 30 years to see where those trend lines are. And I think that's an important part of what we're doing here. And so the public safety, we've done a number of summits. We actually got a summit in before COVID hit last year, so we did a public safety summit. The one that we did, we had an opportunity for the public to come out. We did one again this year where we give an opportunity for the public to come. A lot of what you're going to see, a lot of this presentation is updated from then, but you'll see a lot of that information. And in addition to that, and I think this is an important distinction, and sometimes, when the public calls, and I know, and you're right, the discussion, Councilmember Bremner, you're right. These are always tough decisions that you have to make, that we make, and there's often different perceptions of what our role is. I mean, as a mayor, I can't tell you how many calls, and I'm sure as council members too, there's an expectation you can do everything. And oftentimes the expectation of what you can do is confusing to the public, because when it comes to public safety, I think every elected official, whether they're at the state level or at the federal level, always wants to focus on things that are more immediate to people, and safety usually is. But it's not the federal government's role to what we do here locally. It's not the state's role in what we do here locally. We make those determinations into what we spend and what we do locally. And also, our system too, it's unique, and I talk about this. Our charter and our system is a little different than every city in Minnesota. We're under a different form of government. We're under a strong mayor system. So when the public calls with an expectation of enforcement, for example, in any other city in Minnesota, with the exception of St. Cloud, St. Paul, and Duluth, that's not a responsibility that's given to council because you're a legislative body. It's the responsibility of enforcement is with the mayor. And that was the charter change that was made in 1952. In fact, if you read the supporting material around there, the charter prior to that, and we went through a lot of different governments, we actually had a commission form of government for a period of time where council members or commissioners would be. You'd have the commissioner of public safety, you'd have the commissioner of roads. So council members actually did that. But they were a council as a whole. And in 1952, when they wanted to do this and create a form of government, they created something, and this is written in some of the documents around that time. They wanted somebody they could blame. One person, because boards and commissions, you always have, you kind of, all of you get blamed for it or all get credit, but they wanted someone they could blame. And that's an important distinction in our form of government, and that's why when it comes to enforcement, the responsibility falls on the mayor. Whoever holds this seat, it falls on the mayor. The responsibility in public safety is my responsibility. Now, I hire the chief and the assistant chief, and we hire a lot of great officers throughout this department, but they mess up, that's my responsibility. That's who that responsibility, in an executive branch, that is the way it works. And so when it comes to enforcement and when it comes to statistics, we are, and this is important, as transparent as we can, but when it comes to, nobody's ticketing folks on Roosevelt Road, or we get in traffic enforcement, and AC Oxton's going to go over a little bit about traffic enforcement too, because people don't think we do, and he'll give you the numbers of how much we enforce in traffic enforcement. I usually get the other side of that. Why are you enforcing so much when you should be working on other crimes? But we have a broad spectrum of what we do in public safety. And so when it comes to that type of input, I do lots of town hall meetings. In fact, this presentation, I'm going to be doing in the next 2 weeks in neighborhoods around St. Cloud. Because I think oftentimes we have a perception often that doesn't meet the reality of where the numbers are. People perceive crime to be, in fact, I've heard this from folks, that's just out of control. But if you look at the trend line, you look at the actual numbers, perception doesn't meet with the reality. If you're a victim of crime, though, it's 100%. So I understand that, and we all do that. The reason we survey, even beyond just the numbers of what the statistics are, when we do our surveys, and we're going to be doing another one next year, we actually ask people, their perception. Do you feel safe in this part of town? Do you feel safe at this time of the day, this time of the night? But we also follow up with, have you been a victim of crime? And that survey actually matches very significantly with the data that we have. So I get people say, well, the crimes aren't reported. Well, this is self-reporting in a survey. So they are, and when we focus on an area, you'll see actually numbers go up. In fact, I think, and probably not in this number, but the chief and AC Oxton might talk about, we put a significant amount of resources into sex trafficking a few years ago. And the numbers actually went up because we put more awareness, we put more effort into it. And the greater awareness, the more reporting you get. And we've done a lot over the years and to try to get folks to come forward. So when it comes to the numbers you're going to see, perception is, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the statistics we were showing show 0 crimes going on. Our responsibility is still public safety. We would still invest in that, and we do not just the money, it's not just dollars we put into it, we put resources. You're going to see a lot of collaboration, a lot of partnership. But the tough thing is with these numbers too, and this is, I think, important to understand, you all know this, but I think when we talk about numbers from the public, St. Cloud has a population of 68,000 people now. Is that the new number, right around 68,000? We haven't changed the signs yet, but they still 65. But 68,000 is our number of folks that live in St. Cloud. But that daytime population swells to 180,000 people every day, over 180,000 people. Our police department and police force and the public safety we have is not for 68,000, it's for that 180,000. So we provide public safety for a larger group of folks. But look at the numbers when you go through these, you see that, numbers are, if you look at the numbers, percentages are always a tough thing. I think probably the best example, a long, long time ago on this planet, the murder rate went up 100% when Cain killed Abel. So and our murder rates can go up from 0 to 1, it's 100%. It goes from 0 to 2, 200%. But the perception sometimes, and that's an important distinction, we don't just give these numbers that say crime doesn't exist. The feeling and the perception is important to us too. We want people to feel safe. Doesn't matter what the numbers are. We want people to feel safe in their neighborhood. We want people to feel safe downtown. So we do a number of things also to help with that perception. You see in this budget, I talked about earlier, parking ramps. We want to get people into parking ramps because we have all this availability in parking ramps. So what are we doing? We're hiring private security to go through the parking ramps, even though parking ramps aren't an area where there's a high degree of crime. We're doing it so people feel comfortable. We put cameras around Lake George. We put cameras in a lot of places so that people feel comfortable. We put folks on bicycles. We have people walking the streets in beats that are considered our high-risk areas so that people feel comfortable in doing that. Public safety isn't just the police department. These are those of you you're going to talk about 101, the fire, our fire folks, our inspections. It's a team effort, and that's the thing too. There is no, and I say this often, there's no police department. It's the city who is part of that public safety. So we work as a team. We constantly have discussions as a team on how we can better serve public safety, how we can make people feel better. In fact, our budgets reflect that. The budget that I presented to you has, we're paying for 4 additional officers. We also are paying for what used to be covered with our partnership with the university and the technical community college. We're covering that cost now because we're not going to reduce that part. But we also are working with the private sector, and you'll see a lot of the trends, and you're going to see some of the trends that are in here. We also partner with mental health. With Centricare. We partner with a number of folks to try to make a holistic approach to public safety. So I wanted to at least preface that when we talk about information and when it comes to the enforcement piece of that, we're going to try to, like I said, get into neighborhoods so people can understand in their area. In fact, we're also looking at, we've got data, and we have, this presentation that I'm giving tonight is already on our website. The presentation that we give, we try to be as, again, to be as transparent as possible, but we want people to feel comfortable in what we have. So if you look statistically, these are the numbers you're going to see. But even when an anomaly takes place, we focus on ways to resolve that issue. You'll see in here car thefts. Car thefts went up. We applied for a grant. We were successful in that grant. We have someone that just focuses on car thefts now. We have a number of things that we do to respond, but also important, we do a number of things, and I think this is probably became more evident in the last year and a half than any other place. We hire the best. I believe we have the best police department in all of the United States. And I'm not just saying that, I firmly believe that. I have talked to mayors and councils. The chief has given presentations all over the country. We've testified. This is a model department. Morale is high also in this department. You don't see that. This is a very difficult job that these folks do. And all over the country, between last year and this year, it has become even more difficult. It was one of the most difficult jobs you had before last year. But because of that, it became even more difficult. The Neighbor of the Month award I gave today, this is what folks in this community has always been strong supporters of public safety. I use this. In fact, we just graduated 8 from the academy. And we do an academy, first of all. We hire the best, but we also put them through our standards. And our standards are very high. We don't hire just anybody. And we have people that just went through that academy. I think we had one, but if folks aren't meeting our standards, they don't graduate from that academy. So we put the best of the best in to those departments, and I believe, and I've said this many times, the chief and every single person in that department is really, you should, as a community, as a council and as a community, should be very proud of the folks. Their morale is high because of the community that supports them, and the budgets that we've presented have always been, you have also had the top priority be public safety and infrastructure, and it shows. And we've done studies. We've not only done internal, we did a national study, if you recall, on clearance rate. These folks aren't the ones that lock, they're the ones that arrest people. It's up to another branch of government, the judicial branch of that government, to keep people. And in my opinion, there are some people that shouldn't be on the street. It's not their fault. Their clearance rate is one of the highest in the country. When somebody commits a crime, these folks get them in cuffs and get them off the street. And that is, I think there's no place in this country, and that based on the study that we did, that a number of you seen just a few years ago. So I'm going to turn it over to Chief Anderson and Assistant Chief Oxton to give a presentation, and then all three of us will stand for questions after the presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. Welcome, Chief.
Thank you, Mr. President, lady and gentlemen of the council. I'll just say ditto. I don't know what else I can add. The Honorable Mayor Kleis pretty much said it all, and pretty much everything that I would have said and have said to you all before. I will say this, though. I will reiterate this part. One of the many reasons that we are here tonight is to debunk, to defuse, to eliminate the rumor mill that unfortunately finds its way into our daily narrative. And we are going to do that with information that is actual and that is factual. These numbers are not made up, they are not imagined. We are required by law to report them to the state of Minnesota as well as the FBI. And so keep all of those things in mind as Assistant Chief Oxton goes through this, what I think is a very comprehensive presentation. He is the keeper of those numbers, and most of the questions that any of you might have with respect to those and the trends, he can answer better than I can. And so I have no heartburn about him leading this presentation. And of course, if you all have questions afterwards, as the mayor said, we will stand and answer those questions. Before I turn it over to the chief, please know this. We talk a lot about the Cop House and the impact that it has had not only on the South Side but on the city itself. And you don't have to believe us. Ask the people who live there. Ask the folks who did the independent study and surveyed that entire neighborhood. Ask the national and international reporters and media outlets who have given us very positive press on the things that have happened there since we've opened. It continues to exceed our wildest expectations, and the sky is going to be the limit for that. And lastly, with respect to that, again, you don't have to believe me, but when my phone rings, and oftentimes it rings with people who are responding to some of the bad information that's out there, and I'll give you one example before I finish here. The incident that we just had involving the two St. Cloud State students, which is now public, but before it was all over social media, bad misinformation, lies were blasted all over creation. And those are the phone calls that I get. Those are the phone calls that go to the mayor's office. And I took one email from a gentleman, and it was 2 paragraphs, and everything in it was wrong. Every point that he made was wrong. And I responded to him, and I told him so, very diplomatically, but I told him so, and his response was, "Oh, I didn't know that." It's my job, but I'm a human being. It's very annoying. It's very frustrating, because all we ask, and we get this from our community, and by the way, like most of the people who send some of those nasty emails and phone calls, he didn't live here. And that happens more times than I would care to have to address, but I will. So I'll finish by simply saying this. With respect to the Cop House and what goes on over there, and so that you know the men and women in your St. Cloud Police Department are doing the right things right, we don't get invited to present at an international conference if all of the things that the mayor said and what I am telling you here now and what Assistant Chief Oxton is going to share with you were not true. And so you all have an agency, a first-rate law enforcement agency. I'll put these folks up against anybody in the country, and they will come out on top every time. And if you don't believe me, ask your constituents. So with that, I'll stop bloviating and turn the mic over to Assistant Chief Oxton. Chief?
I thought he was going to shake my hand. President Gerger, members of the council.
All right. The mayor wants hugs, you want handshakes.
No hug. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, so thank you for having us. I just want to say that something I say often to groups, and as I'm sitting here listening to the mayor speak about the state of our department and how our officers feel, and even some of these difficult times, I often tell people it's because we have the support of the council and our mayor. behind her back. And that means a great deal. And I say that to a lot of people, but it seems appropriate I say it to you. So thank you for that support, for all of you. Mayor, thank you. So data, I really believe in data because I think data tells us and helps us to understand where we're at, the factual base for where we're at. And so often today we're bombarded with media that is relevant media, but it's not always happening here. It's happening other places. So we can kind of break down and identify what is happening here and what maybe isn't. Data also helps us to police efficiently and effectively. When we know where things are happening and what's happening here, we can put resources to those things. As the mayor said with sex trafficking, you put resources to it and you can address it and affect it. So I have 12 slides. I just tell you that so you know how long this is as the hour gets a little later. So it's not real long, so we'll whiz through these. I put this next slide in just to show you some examples of what we all hear when we come home, when we turn on the news, when we listen to the news in the morning. Violent crime in Minnesota and across the nation. You can see some of the quotes. 2020 ends as one of America's most violent years in decades. Massive one-year rise in homicide rates collided with the pandemic in 2020. Homicides spike. I came home yesterday from a trip where I didn't have any news, and I found out that 14 people were shot just 70 miles from here and one killed. And so it's hard not to let that affect us and make us feel, as the mayor said, how do we feel? We don't necessarily feel safe when we hear that. And so it's really important we say what is happening here. We're not immune to the things that are happening all over the country and the state. We are seeing some rises here in certain things, but we're also doing good in certain areas that this would lead you to believe we're not. So that's why it's important, I think, we go through this. Real quickly, where we get the data, and I do this for everybody that's watching. Many of you know this, but I just want to go over it quickly. Uniform crime reports, both put out by the federal FBI, and then the state also puts these out. The BCA does every year. They come out in March, as the mayor indicated, so we don't have numbers for 21. That's where we'll go into our second set of data here in a moment, but we will look at the 2020 and compare that to the past because those numbers are out. And those are very definite numbers. Those are numbers produced by our records management system, which at the end of the day, when we get done with a call, it goes into our records management system, and then we report to the state and to the feds. So they're very accurate data. That's what we're going to look at first. So when we look at St. Cloud crime trends and the data sources, the one is the uniform crime reports, and we'll go into that in a second. The second one is our computer-aided dispatch system, or CAD. We have dispatchers, they're county employees. The dispatch for us. Anytime a call comes in, anytime an officer starts a traffic stop or something proactive, they start a number and they generate a CAD call. And so they might get a caller saying there's people fighting, so they'll start a fight call. They'll send officers to it. If it turns out to be a domestic, it's not a fight anymore, it's a domestic, the officer will change that back to a domestic. So we have a way to kind of track fairly accurately what we're seeing, but it's not as accurate as the UCR data. It does, though, allow us to have up-to-date trends that we can see in how we're doing. And what I'll tell you, after doing this a long time, the CAD data usually tracks very well what the end-of-the-year numbers show. Okay, so if we see a trend increasing in one area, at the end of the year, the UCR numbers will almost always show that that's true, and that's what we see for the final numbers. So we're going to go into some other data after that that shows kind of our CAD stuff, and I'll tell you when we do that. Real quickly, calls for service. So far in 2021 to date, we've done about 41,000. It's a little higher than that. This must be a few days old, but we're around 43,000 calls for service right now. So 43,000 CAD calls generated. And then traffic stops, we've made, just about 6,000 traffic stops this year. So sometimes it feels like there's not enough traffic enforcement going on. We're making thousands of traffic stops out there. So there's a lot of enforcement going on. Shifting back, uniform crime reporting data. You can see on the presentation, Part 1 crimes. It's kind of split into two crimes, Part 1 and Part 2. And this is how the feds do it and how they have us report to them. The first is made up of the categories in Part 1 of murder, aggravated assault, robbery, rape, burglary. They use the term larceny, that's theft. We use the term theft in Minnesota. Larceny is what the feds use. Motor vehicle theft and arson. The second, Part 2 crimes, is lesser crimes. All other assaults, forgery, fraud, vandalism, disorderly conduct, so and so. There's a list of those. So the Part 1 crimes are usually considered the more severe, the violent crimes. The next slide we look at is what the mayor referred to, and this is a 30-year snapshot. So this goes back a long time, 89, that's when I graduated high school. Anyway, and so 30 years ago, that's where we were at. You can see that it fluctuates year to year, and there is some fluctuation within that graph. But the trend line is the black line. And the trend line is a formula that you put in to account for all of those numeric points. And then it comes up to tell you, are we flat? Are we increasing overall? Are we decreasing? And you can see that trend line is actually decreasing over the 30 years. You can see that there's spikes, though, both low and high. When we get down to the end in 2020, I know those numbers are hard to see. It's a lot of data, but it's, I think, better to see the whole graph than actually read the numbers. The last one is 2020. We saw a spike again last year. So we did see an increase in 2020 of Part 1 crimes. And in a moment, we're going to break that down and look at where they were, because that's really important. There was obviously a list of those crimes. The good news is, though, for us, is that over that time period, we are decreasing. We're showing that trend line going down. And I work the road. I've been here now 26 years. So, 24 years ago, I was on the road taking calls, going to these things. And I remember what it was like back then. And that makes sense to me. So anecdotally, that makes sense to me. The numbers that we're seeing here do as well. So this is just breaking down that chart a little bit more and looking exactly what we are. We have some years to compare to. So we go back to 2016, and then we have each consecutive year after that through 2020. The difference is between 2019 and 2020. So in 20, you see we have an increase of about 529 calls in those Part 1 crime categories. It is an increase. You saw it on the chart. It is a spike. It's not the highest year we've ever had, but it is a spike. When we look down, though, in 2020, and you see what we had for the actual data or the calls for service, you can see what didn't go up. Murder was flush that year. We had 2 in 2019, two in 2020. Aggravated assaults were actually down. So that's one of the things that, according to that first slide or second slide we looked at, that's not what the news leads us to feel or to believe. But here, what we saw was we actually saw a decrease in that. Robberies were up by 15. Sexual assaults were down by 19. Not, again, a significant decrease in something that wouldn't necessarily lead you to believe that is happening based on what we hear every day. Burglaries were up, and then thefts were up about 500. Motor vehicle thefts were also up as well, as the mayor said, 63. And then 10 up in arson, and part of that is because some of the unrest we felt too in 2020. When you look at the difference, though, on the top, the good news here in this chart overall is that the majority of that difference is in thefts. And if all of those crime categories, you want one to be your problem or one to be your contributing factor to that increase, it would probably be the theft category, obviously, rather than some of those others. So we saw an increase in thefts that really bumped up and made our Part 1 crimes go higher that year. We have some additional data at the bottom just showing homicides over the past years. We are this year at 4 homicides. We've had 4 homicides in 2021. In 2015, we had 4 homicides, and that's the highest year I could find going back. And so right now we're at that high mark that we had in 2015, and that's just something that we need to track and watch. So this is the same slide, but for Part 2 crimes, which is all other crimes, and you can see there we actually have a trend line that's going down as well over the 30-year period, maybe even a little bit more substantially than the first one. So that's good to note too. In 2020, you can see that we actually saw a decrease from the years before that, where it kind of remained steady there for several years. If we look back here, Part 2 crimes at the bottom, you can kind of see the numbers and how they lay out. And in 2020, the difference was about 236. So that too, when you talk about all the other crimes that we have, disorderly conduct, vagrancy, all those different things, when you look at in total, we saw a decrease in those as well. So here's where we change gears a little and we look at those CAD calls in that data where we can look at present time stuff. So this is pulled from January 1 to September 30th each year. So we're kind of looking at apples to apples each year. Those aren't full year data, it's the same time period, but it brings us right up to date. And I pulled similar categories to what some of the ones we just looked at in the UCR data is. And then what I did, we heard earlier people talking about, you almost got to throw 2020 out the door. because of how unique of a year it was. So what I did is I averaged 2017, 18, 19, and 20, got an average, that's the 4-year average, and then we look at 2021 where we're at to kind of get a feeling of like, how do we compare to the past? And so you can see here, we'll just start from the top down, but assault, we're actually trending down or down right now. Burglaries down. This is a good one, thefts. Remember, that's what kind of jacked that Part 1 crime rate for last year is actually down 181 right now, again, as of September 30th. Motor vehicle thefts are high. That's one thing we continue to see. We're happy we have that investigator assigned to these now through the grant, but again, he'll also need time to work on these, but right now that's what we're seeing. Arson and sexual assaults, both are showing decreases currently. An area where we've seen increases, though, and I told you we're not immune to the stuff going on, is gun violence. Gun violence is something that, again, we hear about that all over the state, all over the country, and we've seen that here as well. So when you look at gunshot calls, you can see where we're at, plus 16. Person with a gun, plus 24. So that's significant to us. And we are seeing more guns in hands of those who are not supposed to have guns and committing crimes with guns. And that's one of the challenges we have before us right now. Domestics are actually up too. An interesting thing, in 2020, we track these calls monthly. And I do this every month. I run the numbers at the end of the month just to see where we're at so we kind of know. So if we see something goofy happening, we can put resources to it. When we had the shutdowns because of COVID, a lot of people thought domestics would go up because everybody's at home, and they thought, hey, everybody at home for long periods of time may make domestics go up, and we actually didn't see that here. They actually stayed pretty level, and we didn't see that. But now, in 2021, we've actually seen some increases going on. So we are up 46 in domestics. Probably the biggest area, though, that we've seen increases, and this just didn't start because the question is this because of COVID? I think that probably, in my guess, I think that helped. But before COVID, we were already seeing this happen. Behavioral health calls are going way up really quick, and you can see that in the slides. A little bit, I just want to preface by 2017, that might be a little bit of a coding issue there from jumping from 171 to 414. So that, I think, might have been coding where we interjected a different code to help better accurately report these. But after that, I think it's pretty stable, and it's growing very quickly. So 314 calls. Overdoses, up 19. We have dangerous drugs. I'm going to go into that in a second that we've seen as across the state has seen in the country as well. Suicide threats are actually down. I think that is because of some coding that we're using with that behavioral health category, because the suicides in progress are up. I think when there are suicide threats, a lot of times they're being coded now as behavioral health calls, where if a person's saying, I'm about to hurt myself, that goes in as a suicide in progress, and that's why those are tracking up as well. And then welfare checks. And welfare checks are way up, as you see, and oftentimes the end of a welfare check is behavioral health related. And so it's really important that I think you all know that what we're seeing and what we're going to, these are the numbers that we're seeing the greatest increases in. Just a few slides, dangerous drugs, fentanyl, and you've all heard about that in the news, and that is here. We are seeing that. Oftentimes it looks very similar, or it's actually a replica pill of legitimate, pills that people take, and people are overdosing on that. It's also becoming a drug of choice for some users and abusers, and it's a very, very powerful drug so that they have a hard time not sometimes overdosing. You can see in the top, one of the things we carry now is Narcan. And you can see how the use of Narcan has gone up dramatically by our officers in the field. From 2018, we had 13 uses. In 2020, we had 40 deployments of Narcan. And that stuff is amazing. It saves people's lives. It can take a person that actually looks like they might actually be dead before you, and you give them Narcan. It's a nasal squeeze that you give it to them, and they literally come to and come back. And so a very important thing that we're doing, but it's something that's alarming, the overdose rate. So we continue to work with our drug task force, violent offender task force, I should say, to address that. Again, this is just behavioral health calls, some stats from across the country. This isn't just happening here, it's happening all over. And what I would tell you, in my opinion on this, being in this job for this long, it's because there's just no resources out there. And I'm not talking about police resources. It's resources across the board. We need more resources across the state for mental health services. Hospitals are full. There's no place for people to go. There's a Care 11 series going on right now talking about the cracks sometimes of what happens when people fall through the cracks of the system, and unfortunately that's very true in my opinion as well, but it is a lack of services. Behavioral health is a community problem, not a police problem, but we get there because it's so bad it goes to crisis, and then people call us. Oftentimes medical professionals call us to go take these behavioral health calls. So we continue to do that, but again, kind of following suit with what the mayor and the chief has said about the quality of our department. I think we're doing it in cutting edge ways, in outside the box ways that are just really effective. This is our behavioral health co-responder team. So in the top we have Kinsey, who's a mental health professional from Central Minnesota Mental Health. She goes out with Officer Holden, 2 calls for service that are behavioral health, and they work together. Officer Holden provides a safety net there to make sure it's a safe environment for the mental health professional to work, but then when they get there, they decide who is going to be best. It's not always the mental health professional either, I'll note. It's kind of interesting when I talk to them. Sometimes people are like, I don't want you to take me away. I want to go with I'll go talk to the cop. And sometimes it's the other. But as a team, they work really effectively in providing people really quality service in a time when you see that people are struggling to do that all over the place. So we're looking to expand this, and I think that'll be a really good thing. The other thing they do is they do wraparound care, and that's that they'll get follow-up calls from our officers about problem places where maybe somebody's calling, repetitively and it's mental health. They'll get that, and even though they maybe didn't respond to the call, they'll provide services and try to get that person the help they need so that they don't get into crisis, which then leads to a police call. And that prevention is so key, and it's again working with our partners like Central Minnesota Mental Health, and Stearns County is a part of this too. They've been a great help in helping us with this. Our community action team, and somebody asked about CentraCare, a huge help to us. We have great community partners that take this on as a community problem, but our community action team is something that when we take the people who we deal with most on the street, and this is a lot of times behavioral health, sometimes substance abuse, but we might be going to, as you can see in the bottom, 30 calls, 40 calls to this one person. When we start talking with our partners and we find out that, guess what, they already have a caseworker assigned to them, but the caseworker didn't know that we're having 20 contacts a week with them, because sometimes the dots aren't connected. So we connect the dots by taking the professionals in the system, probation, it might be a probation officer, it might be a counselor, it might be a social worker, and then we get them wraparound care, and guess what happens? The calls go away. It goes away. And then we're not getting sent to crisis calls. The person is doing so much better, and it's the way to go. So we're very proud of the CAT team, and it's a collaborative approach. The one thing I'll say about that co-responder that I think is cool, there's some departments that are hiring social workers. We have a lot of good social workers. We have a lot of good mental health workers that we need to work together with the people we have in our community, and that's what we're doing with the Central Minnesota Mental Health Center. We're getting close. And actually, this is on our community outpost, so I'm going to turn it over to the chief. You already mentioned that, talked about this a little bit, but this just gives you some graphics.
Well, as I said earlier, thank you, Chief. This place continues to exceed our wildest expectations. Imagine, this is one of those places where, we've all been asked the question, boy, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? And every single day, our Cop House staff continues to impress not only me, but the entire command staff and the community, because it's like they have a magic wand. And the coolest part about my job now with respect to this is I'm the person who gets to say yes. And they have all kinds of fantastic ideas. We have started several sports leagues. When you think about our CYA, our youth authorities, whether they be for hockey or basketball or baseball, football, whatever, we've started our own. And we're serving all those kids. I'm going to tell you one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Being a man of color from the hood, I saw a bunch of black kids on ice skates last winter. Never been on a pair of ice skates in my half-century plus on this planet. And it gets even cooler because our own St. Cloud State University hockey team, Division I program, Frozen Four participants, we're running the camp for the kids. How cool is that for a kid, right, to have any contact with a college athlete, let alone ones that play at that level? The coach was there. the Herb Brooks Foundation found out about this camp and donated all the equipment. And so when I say it's really cool and it continues to exceed our expectations, soak all of those things in, right? When we did a soccer camp this summer, the Sine Foundation from St. Paul came down. Okay, these are, and you know, I feel this way too. You guys might. In Minnesota, we're very metrocentric, right? People don't think much goes on outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul, but for them to call on us and ask if they can participate when they find out some of the cool things we're doing, I think speaks volumes to the effort and the resources and the planning that goes into it. And it's not all about sports. We're still doing the ESL programs. We're still bringing services to the folks in that neighborhood, whether they're from Stearns County or from public health, you name it. We're still running medical and dental clinics out of there for folks that otherwise wouldn't have access to that. And I think this year, this summer was the first summer. If you hadn't heard, there was a cool article in the Times the other day about the community garden, so that we can bring more nutritious eating habits, and not that we're preaching to people, but these are things that some of those folks over there wouldn't normally have access to. And it's not just about the food part, it's, again, bringing people together in the neighborhood. So these are things to be proud of. Our Women of Worth program, we were invited by a room full of generals, military generals. When they heard about this program, they invited our staff and some of those young ladies to their leadership development program that they do for female officers in the military. And it goes on and on and on and on. And not only do they invite us, they ask, how can we partner? They've done a couple of site visits, so stay tuned. I'm sure you'll be hearing more about ways that they want to partner with us and some of the things they have in store for us to give a try. So, you know, I'm technologically.
That was it.
Oh, there it is.
We finished on
Perfect.
That was 12.
So lots of really good things going on. And, you know, when it comes to the crime aspect, know this, and I say this to every group that we address, we can't be everywhere. That's not an excuse. The best news, though, is we get the right people in cuffs. If we can't be there to mitigate it after the fact, we get the right people in cuffs, and we hand them over to that other branch of government to do with what they see fit. But our folks are diligent.
Well, thank you, Chief Anderson. Assistant Chief Oxton, thank you for the presentation. I think you ended on a great note.